In the Middle Ages, the household was the heart of daily life. It was more than just a place to sleep or eat. It was the center of production, care, and survival. And at the center of the household stood the women who managed it. Their role was not always written in chronicles or praised in poems, but it was essential. Without their work, both small cottages and large estates would have struggled to function. Medieval society was built on layers of duty and responsibility. Kings ruled kingdoms, lords governed lands, peasants worked the fields, and craftsmen supplied goods. But in every level of this society, from the poorest peasant family to the wealthiest noble household, women carried the responsibility of keeping homes running. They organized food, clothing, and care. They supervised servants if they had them, or labored themselves if they did not. They passed on skills to children and ensured that daily life continued in a steady rhythm. For noble families, household management meant overseeing estates with many workers, stores of food, and servants to command. For peasant families, it meant hands-on labor, spinning, baking, and tending animals while still helping in the fields. The scale differed, but the core responsibility was the same. Women made sure that homes remained supplied, that families were fed, and that resources were stretched through the year. This management required knowledge, patience, and constant attention. It meant knowing how much grain to grind into flour and how much to keep for seed. It meant preserving food for winter when harvests failed. It meant sewing and mending clothes, preparing remedies for illness, and keeping order in a space where life was fragile and resources scarce. Though women often had fewer rights under law than men, their contribution through household management was irreplaceable. Lords could command knights, and peasants could till the fields, but it was women who kept households alive day after day. Their work was not glamorous, but it was steady and enduring, shaping the rhythm of medieval life in ways that were both ordinary and vital. Managing a household in the Middle Ages was a demanding task, and women carried much of this responsibility. The household was not only a family home, but also a center of production, storage, and organization. To keep it running smoothly required constant effort. A woman's role as household manager meant balancing many different duties at once, ensuring that her family, and often others in her care, had what they needed to survive. The daily work of a medieval woman depended on her family's status, but the basic responsibilities were similar everywhere. Food, clothing, and shelter formed the foundation. Food had to be gathered, prepared, and stored. Clothing had to be spun, woven, and sewn. Shelter had to be cleaned, maintained, and supplied with warmth. These were not simple chores to be done occasionally. They were constant, repetitive tasks, each with its own challenges. In peasant homes, women were directly involved in almost everything. They cooked meals over open hearths, kept track of supplies of grain or vegetables, and made sure livestock were fed. They tended gardens, milked cows or goats, churned butter, and collected eggs. At the same time, they cared for children, looked after the sick, and helped with fieldwork during busy seasons, like planting or harvest. Managing a household at this level meant doing many jobs at once, with little rest in between. In noble households, responsibilities were more supervisory, but just as demanding. A lady of the manor might not churn butter herself, but she had to oversee the servants who did. She directed cooks in the kitchen, maids in the halls, and sometimes craftsmen on the estate. She had to ensure that storerooms were stocked, that accounts were kept, and that food and supplies were distributed properly. Mistakes could mean shortages in winter or unrest among the servants. Even with help, management required sharp attention and steady oversight. Household responsibilities also extended to planning ahead. A medieval home could not rely on modern conveniences like markets stocked year-round. Women had to think seasonally. Grain harvested in summer needed to last through winter and into spring. Meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried before it spoiled. Firewood had to be collected before the cold months. Failure to plan carefully could leave a family short of food or fuel, with serious consequences. Another responsibility was organization of labor. In larger households, women coordinated the work of others. In smaller homes, they balanced their own time. Even children were drawn into household tasks, learning to spin, carry water, or tend animals. Women directed these efforts, teaching younger family members and ensuring that everyone contributed. The household, in this sense, was not just a place of consumption but a workplace, and women were the managers who kept it running. Women were also expected to maintain hospitality. Visitors, whether neighbors in a village or guests in a noble hall, had to be fed and housed. A well-run household reflected positively on the woman in charge. Hospitality showed order, generosity, and respectability. Providing a guest with bread, ale, and a bed was not only kindness, but also a duty that reinforced social ties. Household management also meant coping with shortages and crises. A poor harvest, illness in the family, or damage to the home demanded quick adjustments. Women stretched supplies, substituted foods, or found ways to make do with less. Creativity and resourcefulness were as important as routine. The ability to adapt could mean the difference between survival and hunger during lean years. In every case, the household was judged by how well it was maintained, and that judgment often fell on the woman. A clean, orderly, well-supplied home reflected competence and respectability. A neglected or disorganized one reflected poorly on her. This pressure made management both a duty and a source of pride, for the household was the stage upon which women's daily labor was most visible. Through all of these responsibilities, food, clothing, planning, labor, and hospitality, women shaped the rhythm of medieval life. Lords and kings might command armies, but households were where survival was secured, and women's steady management made that possible. Among the many tasks medieval women carried out, none was more central than providing food for the household. Eating was not just a matter of comfort, it was survival. To make sure there was always enough to eat, women had to plan carefully, cook daily, and preserve food for the months when little could be gathered from the land. Managing food required both knowledge and constant effort, and it was one of the clearest ways in which women kept the household alive. The medieval kitchen looked very different depending on whether one was in a peasant cottage or a noble manor, but the basic principles were the same. In most homes, the hearth fire was the center of cooking. There were no stoves or ovens as we know them today. Instead, food was boiled in pots hung over flames, roasted on spits, or baked in simple clay ovens. Maintaining a steady fire was itself a daily responsibility, since it provided not only warmth, but the heat needed to cook. Women gathered wood, dried peat, or in some cases charcoal, making sure fuel was always at hand. Planning meals required attention to the seasons. In summer and autumn, fresh vegetables, fruits, and dairy products were more plentiful. In winter, diets relied heavily on bread, grains, salted meat, and stored produce. Nothing could be wasted. Leftover scraps were made into soups or stews. Bones were boiled for broth. Even tough cuts of meat were used once softened by long cooking. Every item had a place in the kitchen economy. Bread was the staple food across medieval Europe, and women were closely tied to its preparation. In peasant households, women might grind grain into coarse flour using hand mills and bake bread in simple clay ovens. On manors, peasants often had to use the lord's mill, paying a fee to grind their grain. In noble homes, baking was done on a larger scale, with servants producing loaves for entire households. No matter the scale, women oversaw the process, making sure flour supplies were managed and bread was baked regularly. Another central responsibility was preserving food. Without refrigeration, women had to use traditional methods to keep food from spoiling. Meat could be salted, packed into barrels, smoked over fires, or dried in the sun. Fish was salted or dried in coastal and river regions, becoming a major source of food during fasting days when meat was not allowed. Fruits and vegetables were stored in cool cellars, dried, or made into preserves. Cheese and butter were ways to extend the usefulness of milk. Ale, brewed in many homes by women, provided a safe drink when water was unreliable. All of these methods required skill, timing, and constant practice. Cooking also reflected social status. Peasant women prepared simple meals of bread, porridge, cabbage, onions, beans, and occasionally meat if it was available. Wealthier households, however, served more elaborate dishes: roasted game, seasoned sauces, and spiced stews. Noble women oversaw cooks and servants, ensuring meals reflected the family's standing. A poorly managed kitchen could be seen as a sign of weakness or incompetence, while a well-supplied and well-run kitchen displayed prosperity and order. Women also had to manage storerooms. Grain, flour, salted meat, and barrels of ale had to be monitored to last through the year. Spoilage or waste could be disastrous. Winter and early spring were the hardest times, when supplies ran low and fresh food was scarce. Careful rationing was essential, and women often carried the burden of stretching what little remained. They knew how much bread could be baked from a sack of flour, how many meals could be made from a barrel of saltfish, and how long the woodpile would last. Their calculations kept hunger at bay. The kitchen was also a social space. Women worked together there, whether as family members in a cottage or as servants in a manor. Daughters learned from mothers, apprentices from mistresses, and younger women from older ones. Skills were passed down through generations. Recipes were less written instructions than habits, repeated until they became instinct. The rhythm of stirring pots, kneading dough, or tending fires was part of daily life, shared across families and communities. Hospitality played its part as well. Visitors were judged by the food set before them. A guest offered bread, ale, and cheese saw not only a meal but a statement of the household's order and generosity. For lords and nobles, feasts displayed wealth and honor, and noblewomen were often credited with ensuring the success of these occasions. Even in small homes, sharing food with neighbors or travelers reinforced bonds of community. In this way, managing food in kitchens was about far more than cooking meals. It was about planning for the future, preventing waste, ensuring survival, and representing the household stability. Women's skill in this area kept families fed through harsh winters, famines, and unpredictable harvests. Their steady work at the hearth and in the storeroom made the difference between want and plenty, between disorder and survival. If food was the first necessity of life, clothing was the second, and managing it fell largely to women in the Middle Ages. Clothes were not easily bought from markets or shops, as they are today. For most families, garments were made at home, requiring long hours of labor. Women ensured that their households had something to wear in every season, patching, sewing, and creating garments that could endure years of use. The process of making clothes began with raw materials. Wool was the most common fabric in Northern Europe. Sheep provided fleece each year, which had to be shorn, washed, carded, and spun into yarn. Women often took part in each of these steps, especially spinning, which was so closely tied to their work that the word spinster came to mean an unmarried woman. In warmer regions, flax was grown and processed into linen. Linen required pulling, soaking, beating, and spinning, another set of labor-intensive steps. Wealthier households sometimes imported silk or fine cloth, but these were luxuries. For most people, wool and linen, produced and managed by women, were the basis of all clothing. Spinning was a constant task. A distaff and spindle were common tools in peasant homes, used to twist wool or flax fibers into thread. It was slow, repetitive work, but essential. Even when walking or tending children, women might spin, turning idle moments into production. The thread produced was then woven into cloth. In peasant households, simple looms were used to make coarse fabrics. In noble homes, weaving might be overseen or contracted out, but women still organized the process, making sure raw materials became usable textiles. Once cloth was available, it had to be dyed, cut, and sewn. Dyes came from plants, roots, and minerals, producing shades of brown, green, blue, or yellow. Bright, expensive dyes like crimson or deep blue were reserved for wealthier families. After dyeing, cloth was cut into tunics, dresses, cloaks, or hose. Women sewed garments by hand, using needles made of bone or metal and thread they had spun themselves. Every garment was the product of hours, sometimes days, of steady effort. Clothing also required constant maintenance. Medieval people owned far fewer garments than modern ones, so each piece had to last. Women mended tears, patched worn areas, and altered clothes to fit growing children. Outgrown garments were passed down, cut smaller, or reused as rags. Nothing was wasted. Old wool might be felted into heavy fabric for blankets. Worn linen could be repurposed for household cloths or bandages. This recycling was not only practical, but necessary in a world where cloth was expensive to produce. For noblewomen, household management included overseeing teams of spinners, weavers, and seamstresses. A lady of the manor directed servants to produce fine linens for the table, embroidered hangings for the hall, or new garments for the family. Embroidery was often done by women of noble status themselves, both as a skill and as a sign of refinement. The embroidered cloths they produced decorated churches, chapels, and homes, reinforcing both wealth and piety. Clothing also reflected seasonal needs. In winter, heavy woolen cloaks and layers were essential to withstand the cold. In summer, lighter linen garments allowed work to continue in the heat. Women planned and prepared these wardrobes ahead of time, ensuring families had garments ready for every season. Preparing for winter especially meant making and repairing warm clothing before the cold arrived. Beyond survival, clothing carried symbolic meaning. For peasants, plain tunics and work clothes reflected their station. For nobles, fine fabrics, bright dyes, and elaborate embroidery displayed wealth and status. Women managed this symbolism, ensuring their households presented themselves appropriately. A noblewoman had to maintain garments that reflected her family's dignity when hosting guests, while a peasant woman had to keep work clothes serviceable for labor in the fields. Both tasks demanded care and attention. The skills of spinning, weaving, and sewing were passed down from mother to daughter. Girls learned from a young age how to handle wool, flax, and needles. By adulthood, these skills were second nature. The continuity of these practices ensured that each generation could clothe itself, regardless of wealth. For noble daughters, embroidery and fine sewing were also considered markers of education and refinement, preparing them for their own roles as household managers. In this way, textiles and clothing management formed a constant part of women's work. It was not occasional but ongoing, repeated season after season. The rhythm of spinning, weaving, sewing, and mending was part of the daily life of medieval women. Their steady labor kept families clothed, warm, and respectable, ensuring survival and reinforcing the household's place within society. A central part of a medieval woman's role in managing the household was the care and education of children. Families were not only units of survival in the present, but also investments in the future. Children carried forward the labor, traditions, and names of their families, and it was largely the responsibility of women to raise them, instruct them, and prepare them for adult life. Child-rearing began at birth. Infant mortality was high, and mothers carried the heavy burden of protecting fragile lives in a world without modern medicine. Women nursed their children, made sure they were swaddled, and guarded them against sickness and cold. Mothers and older sisters often shared duties of care, rocking infants to sleep, carrying them while working, and soothing them with songs and prayers. From the very beginning of life, the household revolved around the steady attention of women. As children grew, women taught them the rhythms of daily labor. Girls learned spinning, sewing, weaving, and cooking by watching and helping their mothers. They carried water, fed animals, and tended gardens. Boys were often drawn into fieldwork, but they also learned household tasks from women in their younger years, before being assigned heavier labor. This early instruction was practical rather than formal. Children learned not from books, but from imitation, repetition, and steady participation in daily chores. In noble households, the education of children was more formal but still overseen by women. Noble women instructed daughters in the arts of household management, sewing, embroidery, music, and manners. Sons might be sent away to train as knights, but their earliest lessons often came from their mothers, learning prayers, basic literacy, or moral instruction. Mothers instilled values of loyalty, piety, and honor, which were as important to noble families as skills in combat or politics. Religion shaped much of this education. Women taught children prayers, church observances, and moral conduct. They explained feast days, led children to church, and reinforced the idea that obedience to both God and parents was central to life. Religious stories and songs were part of early learning, ensuring that faith was passed down from one generation to the next. Women were also responsible for discipline and order in the home. Children were expected to contribute to household work from an early age. Laziness or disobedience was not tolerated, for every pair of hands mattered. A mother or grandmother ensured that children learned the value of labor and understood their place within the household. Order in the family was a reflection of order in the household, and maintaining it was part of a woman's role as manager. Education also extended to future roles in society. For peasant families, this meant preparing children to take over fields, tools, and domestic skills. A girl had to know how to run a household before marriage. A boy had to know how to work the land. For noble families, it meant preparing daughters for arranged marriages and sons for roles as heirs, knights, or clergy. Women oversaw much of this preparation, guiding children until they were ready to step into the roles expected of them. In some cases, women arranged apprenticeships or service for older children. A daughter might be placed in another household to learn skills and eventually find a husband. A son might be apprenticed to a craftsman or sent to serve as a page in a noble house. These arrangements were often negotiated by parents together, but women played a significant part in ensuring that their children's futures were secured. Even in death, women carried responsibility for their children. If a father died, the mother often became the central figure holding the family together. Widows managed households, raised children alone, and ensured that sons inherited or that daughters were married respectably. Their ability to maintain stability in these times of loss showed how deeply household survival rested on women's management. Through nurturing, teaching, disciplining, and planning, women made sure that children grew into adults capable of continuing the household and community. Their work and education was not about schools or books, but about survival skills, traditions, faith, and social order. It was steady, often unrecognized labor, but it shaped the future of every family and, by extension, the medieval world itself. In the Middle Ages, health and illness were part of everyday life, and households had to manage them largely on their own. Doctors existed in towns and cities, but they were rare, expensive, and far from reach for most families. Monasteries sometimes offered medical care, but for villages, manors, and even noble estates, it was women who carried the main responsibility for tending to the sick. Their knowledge was practical, based on tradition, experience, and the careful use of herbs and remedies passed down through generations. The first line of care was always the home. Women were expected to know how to treat minor injuries, soothe common illnesses, and comfort those in pain. Cuts and burns were frequent in a world of open hearths, sharp tools, and heavy labor. Women cleaned wounds, applied poultices, and wrapped bandages made from linen scraps. They knew which herbs eased pain, reduced swelling, or prevented infection, even if they could not explain the process in scientific terms. Herbal knowledge was central. Plants like sage, rosemary, thyme, and mint grew in household gardens and were used for cooking as well as healing. Garlic was believed to fight infections. Honey was spread on wounds to promote healing. Chamomile calmed stomach aches. Yarrow was applied to stop bleeding. Women gathered these plants, dried them, and stored them carefully, so remedies were available year-round. Knowledge of herbs was passed from mother to daughter, often remembered in practice rather than written down. Illnesses that lingered were treated with simple household remedies. Broths were made for the weak, mixtures of herbs steeped in hot water became teas, and compresses were applied to fevers. Women experimented with what worked, relying on memory of what had helped before. Sometimes prayers and blessings were added to the treatment, blending medicine with faith. Healing was not seen as separate from religion. Illness could be considered both a physical and a spiritual trial, so women often turned to prayer alongside herbs. For children, women carried special responsibility. Infants and young ones were vulnerable to sickness, so mothers cared for them constantly. They prepared warm cloths, fed them carefully, and used gentle remedies for coughs or fevers. Older children were treated for the scrapes and accidents of daily play or labor. A woman's ability to keep her children healthy was one of the most important measures of her household skill. In noble households, women sometimes had access to wider knowledge. Books of remedies, copied by hand, circulated among literate families. Noblewomen might keep collections of recipes for medicines, listing herbs, ointments, or baths believed to cure different ailments. They also supervised servants who helped gather and prepare medical supplies. While they could call on physicians if needed, the daily care of the sick still fell to women inside the home. Healthcare also extended to animals, which were vital to households. Women tended chickens, goats, pigs, and sometimes larger animals, applying herbs or simple treatments to keep them alive and productive. A sick cow could mean loss of milk for a family, just as a sick child could mean hardship. Caring for animals was therefore as much a part of healthcare as tending to people. Plagues and epidemics, like the Black Death, overwhelmed these household remedies. In such times, women did what they could, tending to the sick, cleaning homes, and preparing burials. Even when remedies failed, the responsibility for care remained on their shoulders. They managed illness as best as possible, even when survival was uncertain. Healthcare was not simply about treatment but also about prevention. Women made sure homes were kept clean, water fetched regularly, and food preserved safely. They swept hearths, aired bedding, and disposed of waste, reducing the chances of sickness. They brewed ale, which was safer to drink than untreated water. They taught children habits of washing and care, even if the understanding of germs was unknown. Through these practices, they maintained the basic health of the household. Though rarely recognized in chronicles, women's role as caregivers made them the first physicians of the medieval world. Their remedies may seem simple compared to modern medicine, but they were essential in keeping families alive. Without their constant attention, households would have been far more vulnerable to the dangers of illness, injury, and disease. In this way, healthcare and medicine formed another part of the long list of responsibilities medieval women carried. They were cooks, seamstresses, teachers, and farmers, but also healers. Their steady work with herbs, their care for children and elders, and their ability to treat wounds and sickness quietly sustained communities in a world where professional doctors were rare, and survival depended on the knowledge passed down within households. Running a medieval household was not only about food, clothing, and care. It was also about managing resources, making decisions about how to spend, save, and distribute what the family produced or earned. Even when men held the legal authority over property, it was often women who handled the practical details of household finances. They kept track of supplies, balanced obligations, and in some cases, managed entire estates when their husbands were absent. For peasant women, estate and financial management often took the form of budgeting daily survival. Families relied heavily on what they could produce themselves, but there were always dues and rents to be paid to the Lord, as well as tithes to the church. Women made sure enough grain was set aside for payments, while still keeping enough to feed the family through the year. They sold eggs, butter, or small amounts of cloth at markets to earn extra coin, stretching household resources wherever possible. Their careful planning determined whether the family had enough to survive during harsh winters or poor harvests. Peasant women also took part in small-scale trade. Some brewed ale for sale, a common practice since ale was a staple drink. Others sold dairy products, spun wool for neighbors, or made bread to be traded in local markets. The money or goods they earned went back into the household economy, for salt, oil, tools, or other necessities that could not be produced at home. Even these small contributions required constant oversight, as every coin or loaf of bread mattered to a family living close to the edge. For noblewomen, estate management could be far more complex. A noble estate was not only a household, but also a manorial economy, with tenants, rents, and workers. When husbands went to war, traveled, or served at court, noblewomen often stepped into positions of significant authority. They supervised stewards, bailiffs, and reeves, ensuring rents were collected, accounts balanced, and supplies maintained. They approved repairs to mills, barns, and fences, and oversaw planting and harvest to secure the estate's wealth. Noblewomen were also responsible for hospitality and provisioning at a much larger scale. A noble hall required enormous amounts of food, drink, and supplies to feed not only the family but also knights, servants, and guests. Managing these resources was a financial task as much as a domestic one. Storerooms had to be stocked, accounts kept for purchases, and debts paid. A lady of the manor might keep written records or supervise clerks who did so, proving her ability to manage as effectively as her husband. Legal and financial authority could, in certain cases, extend further. Widows especially often managed estates in their own right. Some acted as guardians for underage heirs, running estates until sons came of age. Others managed dowries, inheritances, or lands granted to them through marriage. These women signed documents, witnessed charters, and even appeared in courts to defend their rights. Though women's legal powers were limited in many ways, estate management was one area where necessity gave them real responsibility. Even in smaller households, financial decisions rested heavily on women. They decided how much food could be spared for trade, how many animals could be slaughtered, how much wool to spin for market, or whether to save or spend what little coin the family possessed. They stretched supplies, rationed meals in lean times, and made practical choices that kept households stable. Women also had to balance obligations and relationships within the estate economy. They ensured servants were fed, that children of tenants were cared for when families fell ill, and that debts within the community were respected. These tasks were not separate from finances. They were part of the broader management of resources, labor, and survival. The ability to manage estates and finances was not simply a secondary duty, it was essential to the functioning of medieval society. Lords, knights, and men of rank might fight wars or attend councils, but their households and estates did not stop running in their absence. Women's steady work in managing accounts, overseeing production, and balancing obligations kept the economic base of medieval life intact. In this way, medieval women were not only cooks, spinners, and caregivers. They were also managers, accountants, and estate overseers. Their financial responsibilities were hidden within the household, but they were no less important than the public roles of men. Without their careful management of resources, the system of rents, markets, and estates that sustained medieval society could not have endured. Religion was woven into the fabric of medieval life, shaping not only what people believed, but also how they lived day by day. For households, women often carried the responsibility of maintaining piety, teaching faith to children, and weaving religious practice into daily routines. Just as they managed food, clothing, and care, they also managed the spiritual life of their families. Their influence ensured that religion was not only practiced in churches and monasteries, but also in kitchens, cottages, and manor halls. At the most basic level, women taught children prayers and devotions. Before they learned letters or numbers, children learned the sign of the cross, the Lord's Prayer, and blessings for meals. Mothers led these lessons, repeating prayers aloud until children remembered them by heart. In this way, faith was passed on not in schools but in households, through daily repetition. Women also shaped the religious calendar of the household. The medieval year was filled with feast days, fasts, and holy observances. Women ensured that food and work followed these rhythms. During Lent and other fasting periods, meals were adjusted to avoid meat, relying instead on fish, vegetables, and grains. On feast days, households prepared special meals, sometimes stretching resources to provide something richer than usual. Women coordinated these changes, tying food and labor to the wider rhythms of the church. The household itself was often a place of prayer. Many homes, even modest ones, kept small devotional objects, a crucifix, a holy image, or a rosary. In noble households, private chapels were built, where prayers were said daily. Women oversaw the care of these spaces, making sure candles were lit, cloths were clean, and prayers were offered at the proper times. They created a rhythm of devotion within the home that reflected the larger life of the church. Noble women, in particular, were expected to be examples of piety. They sponsored masses, donated to monasteries, and supported local churches. Some commissioned books of hours, richly illustrated prayer books, used for daily devotion. Reading or hearing these prayers shaped not only their own piety, but also that of their families and servants. Their patronage of churches and chapels tied their households visibly to the spiritual life of the community. Even peasant women with fewer resources contributed in their own ways. They participated in village religious festivals, carried candles in processions, and taught their children the importance of attending Mass. They observed saints' days, prayed for good harvests, and asked blessings for their animals and fields. For them, piety was practical, bound up with the hope of protection and survival. Their prayers blended faith with the realities of daily labor. Women also played roles in charity and care, which were considered religious duties. They gave alms to the poor when possible, shared food with neighbors, and tended to the sick not only as a household task, but as a work of faith. Hospitality to travelers was also framed as a religious obligation. Offering bread, ale, or shelter was a way of serving both God and community, and women oversaw these acts of care within their homes. Religion also shaped women's sense of identity and duty. The church taught that women should be obedient to husbands, diligent in work, and devoted to family. While these teachings reinforced social limits, they also gave meaning to household labor, framing it as service to God. Spinning, cooking, nursing, and teaching children were not only practical tasks, but also spiritual acts when done with devotion. For some women, religion offered wider opportunities. Noble women who managed estates often built chapels or sponsored religious foundations, leaving lasting marks on communities. Widows sometimes entered convents, where they could exercise authority as abbesses, overseeing land and people much like lords. Even within marriage, piety could give women influence, as their reputations for devotion strengthened their family's standing. In all households, from cottages to castles, women ensured that faith remained present in daily life. They kept prayers alive at mealtimes, structured work around holy days, and wove religious meaning into tasks of survival. Their influence kept religion from being confined to churches, spreading it instead into the rhythms of cooking, cleaning, teaching, and caring. Through this constant presence of faith, women maintained not only households, but also the spiritual continuity of medieval society. They linked the smallest acts, kneading bread, lighting a candle, teaching a child a prayer, to the larger structure of belief that bound communities together. In doing so, they ensured that religion was not distant or abstract, but lived out each day within the home. A medieval household did not exist in isolation. It was part of a wider community of families, neighbors, and villages, all tied together by work, faith, and obligation. Women played a crucial role in maintaining these ties. Beyond feeding and clothing their families, they shaped the social life of their communities, offering help, hospitality, and stability. Their work extended outward from the home, making them central figures not only in private households but also in public life at the village and manor level. One of the most visible ways women contributed was through hospitality. Guests, whether relatives, neighbors, or travelers, were received and fed in households. In peasant cottages, this might be as simple as offering bread, ale, and a place near the fire. In noble households, it meant elaborate meals served in great halls, with a lady of the manor overseeing preparations. Hospitality was more than kindness. It was a duty that reinforced social bonds. A well-run household was expected to care for visitors, and women ensured this duty was met. Women also supported their communities through mutual aid. In villages, neighbors helped each other at harvest, childbirth, or during illness. Women shared food when families were in need, exchanged labor for weaving or spinning, and worked together on large tasks like preparing feasts or mending communal facilities. They also supported one another in daily chores, such as washing clothes at streams, gathering water, or tending fields. These shared activities created networks of trust and cooperation, with women at their center. In noble households, women played a role in formal gatherings and celebrations. Feasts, weddings, and festivals were organized with their oversight. A noblewoman supervised servants, arranged seating, and ensured that meals and entertainments reflected her family's status. These events were not merely social. They were political, strengthening alliances, and displaying wealth. The success of such occasions often rested on the lady of the manor's ability to manage details smoothly. Religion was another place where women shaped community life. They participated in processions, holy days, and church feasts, often leading children and servants. They made candles for churches, embroidered altar cloths, and prepared offerings. Through these acts, women reinforced not only their household's piety, but also the collective devotion of the village. Their presence kept faith visible and active in daily community rhythms. Women were also essential in childbirth and care within the community. Midwives assisted at births, bringing both experience and comfort. Neighboring women often attended new mothers, helping with food, chores, and childcare. In this way, the work of one household extended into others, ensuring that no family was entirely alone in times of need. These bonds were vital in an era when medical care was scarce and survival often depended on shared support. Markets and fairs added another layer. Women brought goods to sell: eggs, butter, cheese, ale, woven cloth, contributing to local trade. Their presence in these spaces connected households to wider networks of exchange. They carried news, built relationships, and maintained ties that went beyond their immediate family. In this sense, women acted as communicators and connectors, keeping the flow of information and resources alive between households. Even in daily routines, women shaped the tone of community life. The sight of women spinning together, baking in shared ovens, or tending gardens side by side created rhythms of cooperation. Their conversations carried stories, warnings, and advice, weaving the social fabric of the village. Their gatherings were not only about work, but also about maintaining bonds that kept communities resilient in times of difficulty. Noble women extended this social role on a larger scale. As patrons, they offered charity to the poor, distributed food in times of famine, or donated to churches and monasteries. Their actions were visible demonstrations of generosity, strengthening their family's reputation. A noblewoman known for piety and charity enhanced the standing of her household, binding it to both the local population and the wider network of religious institutions. In this way, medieval women's role in community and social life was as important as their private household duties. They were not only keepers of hearths, but also keepers of connections. By offering hospitality, sharing labor, participating in religious life, and supporting neighbors, they ensured that households were not isolated units, but parts of larger functioning communities. Their influence was quiet, but constant. While men might negotiate alliances or fight wars, women built the everyday bonds of cooperation that made survival possible. The community was sustained not only by castles, markets, or churches, but also by the steady presence of women who managed both homes and social ties. While medieval women were central to household survival, their work was also marked by heavy burdens and strict limits. They carried responsibility for food, clothing, children, health, and community ties, yet their contributions were often overlooked or taken for granted. They lived within a system that valued their labor but restricted their rights, placing them in a position where they worked constantly but held little formal authority. One of the greatest challenges was the endless nature of work. Tasks did not pause or lighten with the seasons. Firewood had to be gathered, meals had to be prepared, and clothing had to be mended, regardless of the time of year. Even during festivals or holy days, much of the preparation fell to women. The household needed food on the table every day, and women provided it. Their labor was invisible to those who benefited from it, but its absence would have been immediately felt. Women also faced the challenge of limited rights under law. In most places, a woman's legal identity was tied to that of her husband or father. Married women could not usually own property independently. Their labor contributed to the household's wealth, but their names were rarely recorded in charters or accounts. Even noblewomen, who might manage estates, did so under the authority of their husbands or sons. Their power was practical and necessary, but it was seldom recognized formally. Another limitation was the physical strain of daily labor. Hauling water from wells, grinding grain, lifting firewood, and working in fields all demanded strength and endurance. Women did this while also caring for children, tending the sick, and keeping homes in order. Pregnancy and childbirth added further strain. With little medical care, women faced high risks during childbirth, and many died young. Those who survived often bore multiple children, increasing their workload rather than reducing it. There were also social expectations that shaped women's responsibilities. The church taught that women should be obedient, modest, and diligent. These teachings reinforced the idea that their place was within the household, managing domestic life rather than seeking authority outside it. Women were praised for patience and humility, not for ambition. This meant that even skilled and capable women were expected to remain in supporting roles, their work framed as duty rather than achievement. Economic limitations added further burdens. Peasant women had to stretch scarce resources, finding ways to feed families even when harvests were poor. Famine, bad weather, or disease could undo months of careful planning. Women were expected to cope with shortages by substituting, rationing, or relying on charity. The stress of scarcity fell heavily on them, since they were the ones responsible for daily meals. Noble women faced different but equally pressing challenges. Managing estates required constant vigilance, especially during times of war or when husbands were away. They balanced accounts, oversaw servants, and defended family interests, yet their decisions could be questioned or overturned by male relatives. Their role demanded authority without granting them full independence, leaving them powerful in practice but restricted in recognition. Women were also vulnerable to social and legal dependence. Marriages were often arranged, with little input from daughters. Widows might gain temporary authority, but remarriage could strip them of independence. Peasant women tied to the land had little chance of leaving their manors, and noble women tied to estates had little chance of choosing their paths freely. Their lives were structured by obligations to family, husbands, lords, and the church, with few avenues for personal choice. Despite these limits, women carried the weight of survival. They worked long hours, performed essential tasks, and shaped the rhythm of households and communities. Their labor was steady, invisible, and rarely celebrated. It was the background against which medieval society functioned, unnoticed when successful, but devastating when absent. The challenges they faced highlight a paradox. Medieval society relied on women, but did not empower them. It praised their patience, devotion, and modesty, while rarely acknowledging the depth of their labor. It expected them to maintain households without granting them equal recognition in law or history. Yet in practice, their contribution was indispensable. By enduring these challenges and working within these limitations, women kept households functioning through centuries of change, hardship, and uncertainty. Their strength lay not in open authority, but in persistence, resilience, and the ability to carry on day after day, through burdens that never truly ended. When we look at the medieval world as a whole, it becomes clear that the management of households by women was one of the foundations of society. Kings ruled kingdoms, lords defended lands, peasants worked fields, and merchants traded goods, but none of these activities could have been sustained without households that functioned day after day, and it was women who kept these households alive. Their work rarely appeared in chronicles or official records, but it shaped the lives of every family, village, and estate across the Middle Ages. The household was more than a roof and walls. It was a center of production and survival. Food was grown, prepared, and preserved there. Cloth was spun, woven, and sewn there. Children were born, raised, and taught there. The sick were cared for, the elderly tended, and guests received. Each of these tasks depended on women's labor and oversight. Without their steady management, the household, and by extension, the larger community, could not endure. Women's role was not only practical, but also social and cultural. They passed down skills from one generation to the next. They taught daughters to spin, sew, and manage homes. They instructed children in prayers and traditions, embedding religion into daily life. They preserved recipes, remedies, and customs, ensuring continuity in a world often shaken by war, famine, and plague. Through these acts, women carried forward not just survival skills, but also culture and identity. Even though medieval law and custom often limited women's independence, their influence was undeniable. A noblewoman might manage an estate in her husband's absence, commanding servants and collecting rents. A peasant woman might stretch supplies in times of scarcity, keeping her family alive through harsh winters. Both were managers of resources, balancing obligations and ensuring survival. Their authority might not have been written into charters or displayed on banners, but it was exercised daily in kitchens, storerooms, and fields. In times of crisis, women's importance became especially clear. When famine struck, it was women who rationed food and found ways to substitute scarce ingredients. When plague spread, it was women who tended the sick, cleaned homes, and cared for the dying. When men went to war, it was women who kept households and estates functioning, ensuring there was something to return to. Their work was not dramatic, but it was resilient, the quiet strength that allowed communities to endure hardship. Religion framed much of this labor, giving it meaning and structure. Women's household duties were often described as acts of piety and service, aligning the daily grind of cooking, sewing, and cleaning with devotion to God. Whether lighting a candle, saying prayers at meals, or teaching children their faith, women connected households to the wider spiritual life of medieval society. They ensured that religion was not confined to churches, but lived in daily routines. The bigger picture reveals a paradox. Women's contributions were essential but undervalued. Chronicles celebrated kings and knights, but they rarely mentioned the women who fed those knights, clothed them, or raised their children. Records described rents and taxes, but not the women who planned households to meet them. Power in medieval society was measured in land and armies, yet the foundation of that power, the functioning of households, depended on women's unseen labor. Their legacy can still be traced today. Many traditions of food preparation, textile work, herbal remedies, and child-rearing passed down through centuries originated in the steady management of medieval women. Even the organization of modern households owes much to their practices of planning, storing, and balancing resources. What they carried out in cottages, manors, and castles laid patterns that endured beyond their time. In the end, the story of medieval women managing households is the story of quiet endurance. Their work did not make headlines in their own age, and it often remains invisible in history books. But it was as essential to the Middle Ages as castles, cathedrals, and battles. Without women's steady labor, there would have been no bread on the table, no clothes on backs, no remedies for illness, and no care for children. The household was the foundation of society, and women were its constant managers. Their contribution was not a single achievement, but a daily rhythm, repeated across generations, holding communities together. It was work that seemed ordinary, yet it was the very structure that allowed medieval life to endure. And in that steady, unrecognized endurance lies their true importance in the bigger picture of history. Imagine for a moment the quiet chill of a pre-dawn morning in the year 1348. The world outside is still shrouded in a deep, velvety darkness, the kind that feels both infinite and intimate. Inside a stone and timber-framed house, a woman stirs. Her name is Alienor. She does not wake to an alarm, but to an internal rhythm, a deep and ancient knowing that the sun will soon begin its slow ascent, and the world will require her attention. Her first conscious breath is a small cloud in the frigid air of the bedchamber, a silent prayer of thanks for the warmth of her sleeping husband beside her and the children in the loft above. This is where our story begins, not with a grand proclamation, but with this simple, profound act of waking. This is the quiet, monumental epic of the medieval household manager, a story woven not from battles and treaties, but from bread, herbs, thread, and an immeasurable depth of resilience. The floor is cold beneath her bare feet as she rises, pulling a heavy woolen shawl over her shift. She moves by memory and touch through the familiar darkness of the main hall, the heart of the home. Her hand finds the iron latch of the door, and she steps out into the yard. The air is sharp and clean, smelling of wood smoke from the banked fire inside and the rich, earthy scent of the turned soil in the kitchen garden. Above her, the stars are still brilliant pinpricks in a vast, dark canvas. This moment of solitude, before the demands of the day begin to chorus, is hers alone. She draws another deep breath, feeling the chill fill her lungs, and offers a silent word of gratitude for the peace of this new day. It is a peace she knows is fragile, earned through constant, vigilant effort, and she does not take it for granted. Her first task is to visit the animals. The soft lowing of the family's single cow greets her as she enters the byre. This animal is not merely livestock, she is a partner in survival, a lifeline. Alienor speaks to her in low, soothing tones, running a hand along her warm flank before settling on the stool to begin the milking. The rhythmic sound of the stream hitting the wooden pail is a kind of music, the first note in the day's symphony. This milk will become cheese, butter, and whey. Nothing wasted. Every substance has its purpose. Every action its place in a complex cycle of sustenance. After the cow, she tends to the few chickens, scattering grain from a pouch at her waist, her eyes automatically counting the precious eggs collected in her apron. These simple acts are the foundation upon which the entire household's well-being is built. It is a physical, tangible form of love, this provision of food and care. Back inside, the central hearth is the next focus. The fire, carefully banked the night before to preserve a precious ember, must be coaxed back to life. She arranges kindling and small logs with practiced efficiency, blowing gently until a flame licks up, hungry and bright. Light and heat begin to push back the shadows of the large room. This fire is the true engine of the home. It will cook their food, heat their water, dry their clothes, and provide the light by which they will mend and spin during the long winter evenings. Tending it is a sacred duty. Its failure means cold, hunger, and darkness. As the flames grow, she hangs a large iron pot of water to heat, the steam beginning to curl towards the smoke-blackened beams overhead. By now, the rest of the household is beginning to stir. Her husband, a carpenter, emerges, stretching and nodding a good morning before heading out to his workshop. The children, 3 of them, tumble down the ladder from the loft, their voices bright and sleep softened. The home, which moments before was a place of quiet ritual, now fills with the energy of life. Alienor's role shifts seamlessly from solitary steward to the central organizer of this small community. She directs the older children to fetch more water from the well, a task that will take them several trips. She helps the youngest dress, her fingers quickly tying laces and smoothing hair. She portions out a simple breakfast of yesterday's bread, a bit of cheese, and small cups of watered ale. There is no chaos, only a flow of activity that she guides with a calm authority. This is her domain, her sphere of influence, and her management is what turns a collection of individuals into a functioning, harmonious unit. With the immediate needs of the family seen to, the deeper work of the day can begin. The management of a medieval household was a feat of logistics, foresight, and encyclopedic knowledge that would rival any modern executive. It began, as all life does, with food, but this was not a matter of compiling a shopping list. This was a continuous year-long cycle of production, preservation, and careful calculation. The kitchen garden, just outside the door, was her primary pharmacy, grocery store, and spice cabinet. Every plant had its purpose. Sage for cleansing and for stuffy heads. Rosemary for remembrance and for flavoring meats. Lavender to scent the linens and to calm restless minds. Mint for settling the stomach and for teas. Thyme, hyssop, marjoram, each a tiny leafy treasure. She would walk these rows daily, her fingers brushing the leaves, checking for pests, noting what was ready for harvest, what needed tending. This knowledge of herbs, passed down from mother to daughter, from wise woman to apprentice, was essential medicine. She knew how to brew a tisane to reduce a fever, make a poultice to draw out infection, and which combination of herbs would make a simple pottage nourishing and delicious. The harvest from their small strip of land in the common fields was the cornerstone of their winter survival. The grain, rye, barley, oats, once harvested by her husband and the other men of the village, became her responsibility. It was she who would oversee its storage, guarding it fiercely against damp and rats. It was she who would calculate with a terrifying precision how much grain could be ground into flour each week to make the bread that was the absolute staple of their diet, ensuring the supply would last until the next harvest. A miscalculation meant hunger, or worse. The milling of the grain was a social event, a trip to the Lord's mill where women would gather and share news, but it was also a moment of tense negotiation and careful measurement. Every loaf of bread that emerged from the communal oven, fired by brush collected by the children, represented a small victory against scarcity. And then came the preserving. Late summer and autumn were a frantic race against time. Fruits from the orchard had to be dried in the sun or cooked into preserves sealed with a layer of wax. Vegetables like cabbages were fermented into sauerkraut in large crocks. Beans were dried and stored in sacks. But the most crucial preservation was of meat. The autumn slaughter of animals that could not be overwintered was a time of immense, coordinated labor. The meat had to be butchered, and then it was Aliénor's art to ensure none of it spoiled. Some would be salted or brined, packed into barrels. Some would be smoked slowly over fires in the yard, the scent of wood smoke and curing meat hanging over the village for days. Every piece of offal, every bit of fat was rendered and used. The fat became soap or candles. The hides were scraped and tanned for leather. Nothing was considered waste. Everything was a resource to be managed with ingenuity and respect. Beyond food, the household was a center of production. The clothes on their backs did not come from a market stall. They began as raw wool from their own sheep or flax grown in their garden. Aliénor would spend countless hours carding the wool, pulling the fibers through wire brushes to align them, her hands moving in a steady, meditative rhythm. Then came the spinning, using a drop spindle to twist the fibers into a strong, continuous thread. This was work that could be done anywhere, at any time, while watching the children, while listening to a traveling storyteller, during the long evenings. The rhythmic whir of the spinning wheel was the soundtrack of a woman's life. Once the thread was spun, it was her skill at the loom that transformed it into cloth. Weaving was a more dedicated task, creating the rough, sturdy woolen fabric known as homespun that would be fashioned into tunics, gowns, hose, and blankets. The sewing, the patching, the darning, these were endless tasks, a constant battle against wear and tear. A well-managed household was a patched household, where garments were turned, let out, taken in, and repurposed until they literally fell apart. The management of resources extended to the financial. While her husband might earn money from his craft or from day labor on the Lord's domain, it was often the woman who managed that money. She was the keeper of the purse, budgeting for essential purchases that could not be produced at home. Iron tools, salt, needles, perhaps the occasional luxury like a pinch of precious spice or a ribbon for a daughter's hair. She might also contribute to the family's income through her own labors. She could sell surplus eggs, cheese, or herbs at the weekly market. If she was a particularly skilled brewer, she might produce ale beyond what her family needed, ale being a safer drink than water, and sell it to her neighbors. This economic agency, however small, was a crucial part of her power and her responsibility. She had to be numerate. The clatter of hooves on cobblestones echoed through the narrow streets of York as the royal procession made its way toward the towering minster. King Edward III, his face set in grim determination beneath a jeweled crown, rode at the forefront, his crimson cloak a splash of vibrant color against the drab stone buildings. The year was 1327, and England stood at a precipice. The young king, barely 14 years of age, carried the weight of a troubled crown upon his shoulders, a crown still stained with the blood of his father, Edward II, whose brutal murder at Berkeley Castle had sent shockwaves through the realm. Beside him rode his mother, Queen Isabella, the she-wolf of France, her expression unreadable beneath her veil of gold-threaded silk. It was she who had orchestrated the invasion that toppled her husband from power, she who had placed her son upon the throne, and she who now wielded the true authority in the land. The air was thick with the mingled scents of wood smoke, roasting meats from the street vendors' stalls, and the underlying pungency of a medieval city, a potent aroma of humanity, animals, and refuse. The citizens of York pressed against the guards lining the route, their faces a mixture of awe, curiosity, and fear. They knew the court had fled London, that the kingdom was vulnerable. The Scottish threat from the north was a constant, gnawing anxiety, a shadow that lengthened with each passing day. The minster's great west doors swung open, a dark maw ready to swallow the glittering procession. Inside, the air changed, growing cool and still, heavy with the scent of incense and old stone. Thousands of candles flickered in the vast nave, their light dancing across the faces of saints carved into the pillars and the brilliant colors of stained glass windows depicting biblical tales. The court assembled in the choir, the nobility in their silks and velvets, a stark contrast to the somber, robed clergy. The Archbishop of York, William Melton, awaited them before the high altar, his vestments of gold and white seeming to capture all the light in the cathedral. The purpose of this northern progress was not merely one of show. It was a desperate bid for stability, for divine sanction. The coronation in London had been a rushed, fearful affair. This ceremony, this reaffirmation of oath and faith in the north, was meant to solidify Edward's hold on a fractured kingdom, and to rally the northern barons to the crown's cause. As the choir began the solemn strains of the Te Deum, their voices soaring up into the vaulted ceiling, one could almost believe that God himself was blessing this new reign. But the political realities waiting outside those holy walls were less forgiving. The problems facing the young king and his regents were legion. The treasury was nearly empty, drained by his father's disastrous wars and his mother's expensive coup. The barons, always restless, saw a child on the throne and sensed an opportunity to reclaim privileges lost under stronger Plantagenet kings. And to the north, Robert the Bruce, the grizzled and brilliant King of Scots, was not merely a threat, he was a conqueror. The Battle of Bannockburn, 13 years prior, had shattered English military pride and secured Scottish independence. Now, Bruce's forces raided at will across the border, burning towns and stealing cattle, a constant humiliation. The ceremony concluded with the king kneeling to receive the archbishop's blessing. The assembled court knelt with him, the rustle of rich fabric a soft counterpoint to the Latin prayers. But the minds of many were not on divine matters. They were on the missive that had arrived by hard-riding courier just that morning. Robert the Bruce was laying siege to Norham Castle, one of the great strongholds of the north. Its fall would open the road to York itself. The prayers in the minster were not just ritual, they were a genuine plea for deliverance. As the court emerged, blinking, into the afternoon light, the festive atmosphere of the city had been replaced by a nervous energy. Messengers on lathered horses came and went from the royal lodgings near the minster. The decisions made in the following hours would set the tone for Edward's entire reign. Isabella and her lover, the powerful Lord Mortimer, who effectively ruled alongside her, knew that a direct military confrontation was a gamble they could not afford to lose. Another defeat like Bannockburn could shatter their fragile regime completely. Yet to do nothing was an admission of weakness that would invite even greater aggression. The council that gathered that evening in the great hall of the Archbishop's palace was fraught with tension. Torches guttered in iron sconces, casting long dancing shadows that made the tapestries seem to writhe with life. The arguments flew back and forth across the oak table. "We must raise the northern levies and march to relieve Norham," urged Henry of Lancaster, the king's uncle, his fist crashing down on the table. "To hide behind these walls while English soil is violated is a coward's act." It is what he would have done. The unspoken name of the deposed Edward II hung in the air, a specter at the feast. Mortimer, calm and calculating, stroked his beard. "And lead a green army, untested and poorly supplied, against Bruce? He has not lost a battle in 20 years, Henry. He would feast on our levies. We would be handing him the north on a silver platter and the king's head along with it." His eyes, cold and intelligent, scanned the worried faces of the barons. He knew many of them despised him, the upstart lover of the queen who now held the reins of power. A military disaster would be the end of him. Isabella, seated beside her silent son, finally spoke. Her voice was low but carried an undeniable authority that silenced the room. "There is a third way. We must fight, but we must fight with a weapon Bruce cannot counter. We fight with gold." She proposed a bold, expensive, and deeply cynical strategy. They would not challenge Bruce head-on. Instead, they would pay him. They would offer a truce, a permanent peace, recognizing his kingship and the independence of Scotland in exchange for a cessation of all hostilities. It was a monumental capitulation, an admission that England had lost its long war for supremacy over the island. But it was also pragmatic. It would buy them the one thing they desperately needed: time. The Treaty of Edinburgh, Northampton, signed the following year, was one of the most humiliating in English history. It not only recognized Robert I as King of Scots, but also promised a marriage between his son and heir, David, and Edward's younger sister, Joan. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and the backlash was immediate and fierce. The English barons, particularly in the north, decried it as a shameful peace engineered by the woman and her favorite. They called Isabella the she-wolf, with renewed venom, accusing her of selling English honor to secure her own power. For Edward, young and impressionable, the event was a formative political lesson. He had witnessed his mother's strength in seizing power, and now he witnessed the limitations of that power, the necessity of sometimes bowing to a stronger force. He saw the resentment simmering among his nobles. But he also saw the result. The northern border, for the first time in decades, fell silent. The relentless drain of men and money stopped. The kingdom could breathe. This breathing space allowed Mortimer and Isabella to consolidate their rule, but in doing so, they planted the seeds of their own downfall. Mortimer's ambition grew in the fertile soil of peace. He acquired lands and titles with grasping greed, elevating himself to the Earl of March and behaving with an arrogance that eclipsed even the greatest magnates of the realm. He held tournaments in which he himself was the unchallenged champion, a blatant display of manipulated power. The court became a place of suspicion and fear, where Mortimer's spies were everywhere, and those who spoke against him often found themselves imprisoned or worse. The young king watched and learned. He was growing into a tall, athletic young man with the classic Plantagenet good looks, fair hair, strong features, and an intense, piercing gaze. He was kept carefully away from the levers of power, a puppet king who was paraded for ceremonies but excluded from councils. He nurtured a deep, smoldering resentment for Mortimer, the man who had usurped his father's place in his mother's bed, and now seemed intent on usurping his own throne. The breaking point came in 1330. The king's own uncle, Edmund of Woodstock, Earl of Kent, was executed on trumped-up charges of treason after being caught in a plot to restore the supposedly dead Edward II. It was a judicial murder orchestrated by Mortimer, a brutal warning to any who would challenge his authority. For Edward III, it was the final outrage. The death of his uncle, a prince of the blood, by the hand of a commoner, for so Mortimer was in the eyes of the ancient nobility, was a stain that could not be washed away. He knew he had to act. He found allies in a small, trusted circle of young nobles his own age, men like William Montague, who shared his frustration and his chivalric ideals. The plan was audacious, a mirror of the coup that had brought him to power. The court was residing at Nottingham Castle, a formidable fortress perched on a high rock, its gates controlled by Mortimer's loyal guards. Mortimer felt. The clang of steel echoed through the narrow valley, a discordant symphony of survival and slaughter. Men screamed, not in fear but in rage, their voices raw against the relentless percussion of battle. The Norman cavalry, those ironclad demons astride snorting warhorses, pressed their advantage with methodical brutality. Harold's shield wall, that legendary bastion of Anglo-Saxon defiance, was beginning to fray at the edges, like a tapestry torn by 1,000 unseen hooks. We must understand the sheer physical terror of this moment. Imagine the weight of a hauberk, thousands of interlocked iron rings, each one soaked with rain and sweat, becoming a second colder skin that weighed down on weary shoulders. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood and the foul acrid smell of emptied bowels. The mud beneath their boots was a churning pinkish slurry, a gruesome paste of English soil and the lifeblood of its defenders. Each man in that wall was a node in a trembling human fortress, his shield, lindenwood reinforced with iron, locked tight to his neighbors, a testudo of desperate hope. They had stood since dawn, a rock against the Norman tide. But a rock, no matter how steadfast, can be worn away by a persistent sea. And the Norman sea was cunning. Duke William, a figure of terrifying energy amidst the chaos, was not a man given to despair. His initial cavalry charges had broken against the English ranks like waves against a cliff, leaving a froth of dying men and horses in their wake. A rumor, swift and deadly as an arrow, had shot through the Norman lines, that the Duke himself had fallen. Panic, the true enemy of any army, began to gnaw at their resolve. It was in this critical juncture that William revealed the caliber of his leadership. Tearing off his helmet, he galloped along the fraying lines of his men, his face a mask of furious defiance. "Regardez," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the din. "Je vis, je viens cry. See me. I live, and by the splendor of God I will conquer." This act of sheer bravado rekindled the faltering Norman spirit. But it was a calculated move, followed by a tactical masterstroke. William, observing the dogged discipline of the English, realized a direct assault was futile. He would break them not with brute force alone, but with guile. He ordered a feigned retreat, a tactic dangerous in its execution but devastating in its effect. A portion of his cavalry, on his signal, turned and fled back down the hill, appearing broken and routed. To the exhausted English on the ridge, it was a sight sent from heaven. The pressure relented. The Norman tide was ebbing. A great ragged cheer went up from parts of the English line. The sight of their fearsome adversaries fleeing was too potent a temptation for the less disciplined ferdmen, the peasant levies who made up the bulk of Harold's army. These were not the professional housecarls, the grim axe-wielding giants who stood as the king's personal guard. These were farmers, blacksmiths, and carpenters, fueled by patriotism and the intoxicating prospect of victory. They broke ranks, ignoring the shouted commands of their thegns and earls. They surged down the slope in a disorganized mob, hungry to pursue and slaughter the fleeing Normans. It was a fatal error. The retreat was a carefully baited trap. Once the English had left the sanctity of their high ground and their tightly knit formation, they were lost. The Norman cavalry, their retreat a pantomime of disorder, wheeled about with practiced precision. Now the hunters became the hunted. The scattered English, isolated and without the protection of the shield wall, were cut down with merciless efficiency. The Norman knights, their lances couched, rode them down. The infantry, following close behind, finished the work with sword and mace. The slope became a slaughterhouse. The disciplined corps of housecarls around the royal standard could only watch in horror, their formation weakened, their flanks exposed. This was the turning point. The battle, which had hung in a precarious balance for most of the day, now tipped irrevocably in William's favor. He began to systematically tighten the noose. Archers were ordered to shoot high, their arrows arcing over the front ranks to fall like deadly rain on the heart of the English position. It was during this renewed barrage, as the afternoon light began to wane on that bloody October day, that fortune delivered its final cruel blow. A lone arrow, whether by chance or skilled design, found its mark. It pierced the eye of King Harold Godwinson. The accounts vary. Some say he was struck down while fighting furiously, others that he was merely directing his troops. But the result was the same. The heart went out of the English resistance. Their king fallen, his brothers Gurth and Leofwine already dead beside him, the resolve of the remaining housecarls crystallized into a final, fatalistic act of loyalty. They closed ranks around Harold's body, fighting not for victory, for that was now impossible, but for the honor of their oath. They would die with their lord. The Norman knights closed in for the final kill. The scene around the standard became a maelstrom of violence, a grim dance of death under the Dragon of Wessex and the Fighting Man of England. One by one, the king's guard were hewn down, their bodies forming a grisly rampart around his own. As dusk settled over the field, the battle degenerated into a mopping-up operation. The remaining English forces, leaderless and shattered, melted away into the surrounding woods or were pursued and cut down by William's vengeful men. The Norman victory was total. The field, which would later be known as Senlac Hill, or Lake of Blood, was silent but for the moans of the wounded and the calls of the carrion birds already gathering in the twilight. William, in a final act of symbolic conquest, pitched his tent on the very spot where Harold's standard had fallen. He had done it. He was the master of England. But the victory at Hastings was not the end of the conquest. It was merely the dramatic, violent prologue. William, now styled the Conqueror, understood that defeating an army was one thing, subduing a nation was quite another. The English aristocracy had been decapitated, quite literally in many cases, on the field of Hastings. The path to the throne was open, but the kingdom itself was a wounded beast, dangerous and unpredictable. His march to London was a calculated demonstration of overwhelming force. He did not take the direct route. Instead, he led his army on a wide, devastating arc through the southeastern counties, a deliberate campaign of terror. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and any hint of resistance was crushed with utter ruthlessness. His message was simple and brutal. Opposition is futile. The will of the English leadership crumbled. When William finally arrived at Berkhamsted, just outside London, it was not to besiege the city, but to receive its submission. The surviving English nobles, along with Edgar the Atheling, the young uncrowned heir of the ancient Wessex line, came out to offer him the crown. They had no choice. On Christmas Day, 1066, in a ceremony fraught with tension and symbolic irony, William the Conqueror was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The event was anything but serene. As the shouts of acclamation from both Norman and English throats echoed within the great church, the Norman guards stationed outside mistook the noise for the sound of a rebellion. In panic, they began setting fire to the surrounding buildings. Smoke drifted into the abbey itself, and the coronation service concluded amidst chaos and terror, a fittingly violent omen for the reign that was to follow. William, it is said, trembled uncontrollably throughout the entire ordeal. He was now a king, but his kingdom was built on a foundation of fear, and he would rule it with an iron fist for the next 21 years. The next 5 years, from 1067 to 1072, are often termed the pacification of England. It was a period of near-constant warfare and rebellion, a bloody process of subjugation that scarred the landscape and shattered the old order. William's method was systematic and brutal. He established a network of castles, first simple wooden motte and bailey structures, later rebuilt in impregnable stone, at key strategic points across the land. These were not palaces. They were instruments of occupation, grim symbols of Norman power from which armed men could ride out to dominate the surrounding countryside. The sight of a castle rising on the skyline, a foreign imposition on the English earth, was a daily reminder of the new reality. William's response was swift and apocalyptic. He moved north with his army with a cold, methodical fury. What followed was the harrying of the North, a campaign of such utter devastation that it would be remembered with horror for generations. The clatter of hooves on cobblestone echoed through the narrow streets of Rouen, a sound that had become as familiar as the tolling of the cathedral bells. Inside the chamber, the air hung thick with the scent of beeswax candles and damp stone, a palpable tension weaving between the assembled nobles whose fine silks and velvets seemed to swallow the flickering light. William, Duke of Normandy, stood before the great oak table, his hands resting on a sprawling parchment map. His knuckles were white. The news from England had arrived not an hour prior, carried by a mud-spattered rider whose horse had collapsed at the city gates. "He has done it," William said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the very stone beneath their feet. "The usurper Harold Godwinson has taken the crown. He has been anointed in Westminster Abbey, under the eyes of God he swore to me he would uphold." A collective intake of breath hissed around the room. The map before them was not merely of territories. It was a web of broken oaths and shattered promises. Years of careful planning, of diplomatic marriages and strategic alliances, were crumbling like old mortar. The year was 1066, and the fragile peace of England was a lie. William's gaze swept over his barons, men of fierce loyalty and equally fierce ambition. They saw not just a betrayed duke, but a man whose destiny had been stolen. The story of the oath was legend now. Years earlier, Harold Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex, had been shipwrecked on the Norman coast. William had welcomed him as a guest, only to later, under circumstances historians still debate, secure from him a sacred oath. Harold had sworn upon the relics of the most revered saints to support William's claim to the English throne upon the death of the childless Edward the Confessor. Now that oath was ash. "This is not merely an insult to me," William continued, his eyes glinting like chips of flint in the candlelight. "It is an insult to God himself, before whose holy relics the vow was made. It is a stain upon the honor of Normandy, and it will not stand." He slammed a fist onto the table, making the goblets jump. "We will cross the sea. We will take what is rightfully ours. We will forge a new kingdom from this treachery." But such an endeavor was a monstrous gamble. To invade England was to stare into the abyss of financial ruin and military disaster. The English Channel was a treacherous, unpredictable moat, guarded by the formidable English fleet and the fierce-fired, the peasant army that could be called to service by the ringing of warning bells across the countryside. Harold himself was a proven and ruthless commander, fresh from a stunning victory over the Norwegian king, Harald Hardrada, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in the north just days before. William's first and greatest task was not to sharpen swords, but to open purses. He needed a fleet, hundreds of ships capable of carrying thousands of men and thousands more horses across the volatile channel. He needed to feed this army, to arm it, to pay it. He began a campaign of persuasion more intricate than any battle plan, arguing his case before his own skeptical barons and, most crucially, before the one man whose endorsement could transform a risky vendetta into a holy crusade, Pope Alexander II. William's envoy, a shrewd and silver-tongued priest, journeyed to Rome and laid the case before the papal curia. He spoke not of territorial ambition, but of sacred duty and violated oaths. He painted Harold as a perjurer, a man who had defied the holy sanctity of a vow sworn on saintly bones. The strategy was brilliant. The Pope, swayed by this narrative of righteous justice, and perhaps seeing an opportunity to extend church influence into an England that had often marched to its own ecclesiastical drum, gave his blessing. He sent a papal banner, a simple white cross on a red field, a potent symbol that legitimized William's invasion in the eyes of all Christendom. It was no longer a duke's war, it was God's. Back in Normandy, the energy shifted from debate to industry. The entire coastline from the Cotentin Peninsula to the mouth of the River Dives became a sprawling, chaotic, and breathtakingly ambitious shipyard. The sound of 1,000 axes biting into timber replaced the sound of debate. Ancient forests, which had stood since the time of the Vikings, were felled. The air grew thick with the scent of fresh sawdust and the tang of hot pitch used to caulk the hulls of the newly built vessels. These were not elegant ships. They were workhorses, broad-beamed and sturdy, designed for one purpose alone: to disgorge men and horses onto a hostile shore. Blacksmiths' forges glowed day and night, their hammers ringing a constant rhythmic counterpoint to the adzes of the shipwrights, beating out swords, axe heads, and the delicate interlinked rings of chainmail hauberks. By August, the might of Normandy was gathered at the mouth of the Dives. It was a breathtaking spectacle. A forest of masts, their sails furled, crowding the estuary as far as the eye could see. The army was a mosaic of feudal obligation and hungry ambition. There were William's own Norman knights, the core of his power, men who had fought alongside him for years. But there were also adventurers and mercenaries from Brittany, Flanders, Maine, and even from Italy, lured by the promise of English land and wealth. This was not a unified national army, but a patchwork coalition held together by the sheer force of William's will and the glittering promise of plunder. And then they waited. For weeks they waited. A persistent, brutal north wind blew directly in their faces, making a crossing impossible. The great fleet was trapped. Supplies began to dwindle. Morale, once soaring, began to sink into the mud of the encampment. Men grumbled. The seasonal window for a safe campaign was closing. Doubts, once whispered in corners, were now spoken aloud. Was God, after all, against them? Had the wind been sent as a divine judgment? William, ever the pragmatist, refused to yield to despair. He used the delay to drill his army relentlessly, to instill discipline into the fractious coalition. He also knew he needed a miracle. In a move of profound symbolism, he ordered the relics upon which Harold had sworn his oath to be brought from Bayeux to the camp. There, before his entire army, he knelt and prayed publicly for a change in the wind, framing their plight as a final test of faith. It was a masterstroke of political theater. And then, as if on command, the wind shifted. On the 27th of September, 1066, the obstinate north wind died down and a gentle southerly breeze began to blow. To the superstitious soldiers, it was a sign from heaven. A great cheer erupted from the camp. The order was given. The invasion was on. The following day, the vast armada set sail. The channel, so long a barrier, was now their road. The sight must have been one of the most formidable of the entire Middle Ages. Hundreds of ships, their brightly colored sails emblazoned with the crosses and hawks of Norman lords, cutting through the choppy gray water. At the head was William's own ship, the Mora, a gift from his wife Matilda. On its mast, instead of a simple banner, flew a great lantern to guide the fleet through the day and night of the crossing. They did not head for the well-defended south coast, where Harold expected them. Instead, they landed unopposed on the morning of the 28th at Pevensey, on the Sussex coast, the very heart of Harold's own personal earldom. It was a deliberate act of symbolic conquest. William was the first to leap ashore, but in his eagerness, he slipped on the wet shingle and fell forward, landing on both hands. A gasp of horror went through his men, a terrible omen. But William, with lightning-fast presence of mind, rose to his feet with his fists full of English soil. "See," he roared, his voice carrying over the crash of the waves. "By the splendor of God, I have taken seisin of my kingdom. The earth of England is in my hands." The omen was transformed into a prophecy of victory. The army poured onto the beach, a chaotic but controlled torrent of men, horses, and supplies. They quickly seized the old Roman fort at Pevensey and established a fortified bridgehead. But William did not linger. After a few days, he moved the entire army east along the coast to the more defensible and better provisioned port of Hastings. Here he built a castle, a simple wooden motte and bailey structure, the first of hundreds that would soon dot the English landscape. It was a statement of intent. He was not raiding, he was staying. News of the landing raced north to London, where Harold was recovering from his hard-fought victory at Stamford Bridge, and mourning the loss of many of his best housecarls, his elite professional soldiers. He had, just days before, defeated one of the most feared warriors in Europe. Now he faced another. The speed of events was staggering. Without hesitation, Harold turned his exhausted army around and force-marched them south, covering the 240 miles from York to London in just a week, a feat of almost unbelievable endurance. He paused in London for only the clatter of hooves on cobblestones echoed through the narrow streets of York, a percussive rhythm that spoke of urgency and purpose. Messengers bearing the royal seal pushed their mounts through throngs of merchants and townsfolk, their faces set in grim determination as they carried dispatches that would alter the course of kingdoms. In taverns and guild halls, whispers spread like wildfire. The king's great matter had reached its boiling point. Thomas Cromwell, that shrewd and calculating son of a Putney blacksmith, now moved through the corridors of power with the quiet confidence of a master chess player, his network of agents and informants stretching across the country like an invisible web. Each piece of intelligence, each carefully documented complaint against the monastic houses, was another thread pulled taut in the net he was weaving around the ancient institutions that had dominated English spiritual life for centuries. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, thick with the scent of coming change. In the great Benedictine Abbey of St. Mary's, the abbot paced before the magnificent stained glass windows of his private quarters, his breviary forgotten on a carved oak desk. The evening prayers had been sung, the Compline service completed with its traditional solemnity, yet sleep would not come. Reports had reached him of commissioners riding through the northern shires, of inventories being taken, of visitors asking pointed questions about the abbey's revenues and practices. The magnificent illuminated manuscripts in the library, the jeweled chalices upon the altar, the very land upon which the abbey stood, all suddenly felt precarious, temporary. Beyond the abbey walls, the town slept fitfully, its dreams troubled by rumors of change and uncertainty. Meanwhile, in London, the king's ministers pored over meticulously compiled reports in candlelit chambers, the flickering light catching the gold leaf on important documents. The Valor Ecclesiasticus, that comprehensive survey of church wealth, lay spread across tables, its figures speaking of immense riches concentrated in religious hands. Cromwell's fingers traced the columns of numbers, his mind calculating not just the monetary value, but the political power such resources could command if redirected to the crown. Here was the means to reward loyal nobles, to fund military campaigns, to build a new class of landowners beholden directly to the monarchy. The dissolution was not merely about breaking with Rome or filling the royal coffers, it was about fundamentally restructuring the balance of power in England itself. The first blows fell not with dramatic force, but with bureaucratic precision. The smaller monasteries with incomes under £200 per year were the initial targets, their suppression authorized by Parliament in 1536. Commissioners arrived with sealed documents and small contingents of armed men, their manner professional and detached as they went about their work. At the Augustinian Priory of Lanercost in Cumberland, the canons watched in stunned silence as their silver plate was weighed and catalogued, their charters examined, their livestock assessed. The prior, a man of learning and piety, who had devoted his life to prayer and scholarship, stood helpless as strangers decided the fate of his community. The local people gathered outside the gates, their faces a mixture of curiosity, anxiety, and in some cases, barely concealed greed as they contemplated the distribution of lands that might soon follow. The process revealed the complex web of relationships that bound these religious houses to their communities. While some monasteries had indeed become lax or corrupt, many others served as centers of learning, hospitality, and charity. The Benedictines of Glastonbury had for centuries maintained the drainage systems that kept the Somerset levels farmable, while the Cistercians of Reval in Yorkshire had pioneered sheep farming techniques that had brought prosperity to the entire region. The dissolution would unravel these networks of mutual obligation and support, creating vacuums that would take generations to fill. The poor who had relied on monastic alms, the travelers who had found shelter within abbey guest houses, the students who had been educated in monastery schools, all would find themselves cast adrift in a changing world. Henry VIII responded with a mixture of negotiation and ruthless force. Promises were made, pardons offered, and then brutally broken once the rebel armies had dispersed. The king's vengeance was swift and terrible. Hundreds of executions, including many abbots and priors who had supported the uprising. The abbot of Gervaux was hanged from his own church tower, a grim warning to any who might contemplate further resistance. The failure of the Pilgrimage of Grace sealed the fate of the remaining monasteries, demonstrating that the crown would brook no opposition to its religious and political revolution. The larger monasteries now fell in rapid succession. Commissioners moved from county to county, their methods increasingly efficient through hard-won experience. At Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, one of the wealthiest Cistercian houses in England, the surrender was signed in November 1539. The monks were pensioned off, the abbey's magnificent library scattered, its lead roof stripped away, its stained glass broken. The silence that descended upon the great church was profound, broken only by the wind sighing through empty windows where once the divine office had been sung 8 times daily. The estate was granted to Sir Richard Gresham, a merchant who would transform the monastic complex into a source of building stone for his other projects. The physical destruction of these magnificent buildings was both systematic and symbolic. The commissioners were under orders to make each site uninhabitable for religious purposes, to prevent any attempt at revival. Towers were pulled down, roofs removed, altars smashed. Yet the scale of the destruction varied considerably from place to place. Some new owners deliberately demolished churches to reuse the stone, while others adapted monastic buildings for domestic use, creating magnificent country houses like those at Titchfield Abbey or Lecoq Abbey. The great nave of St. Albans Abbey Church was saved by the townspeople who purchased it from the crown for their parish church, while at Durham, the local people rallied to protect the magnificent cathedral from destruction. The redistribution of monastic wealth and property created new power dynamics that would shape English society for centuries to come. Vast estates were sold or granted to loyal courtiers, merchants, and gentry, creating a new propertied class with a vested interest in the Protestant settlement. The Seymour family, the Russells, the Cavendishes, many of England's great aristocratic dynasties built their fortunes on the ruins of the monasteries. This transfer of land also had profound economic consequences, accelerating the enclosure movement and disrupting traditional patterns of land use. The monastic houses had often been conservative landlords, maintaining customary rents and practices. Their replacement by commercially minded owners frequently led to increased rents, evictions, and the conversion of arable land to pasture for more profitable sheep farming. The cultural impact was equally profound. The monastic libraries had been repositories of learning and tradition, containing not just religious texts but historical chronicles, scientific works, and literary manuscripts. While some collectors like John Leland attempted to salvage important volumes for the king's library, countless unique works were lost forever, torn up for bookbinders' waste, used to stop bungholes in barrels, or simply burned as superstitious rubbish. The artistic heritage suffered similarly, with magnificent illuminated manuscripts, embroidered vestments, and carved statues destroyed or dispersed. The loss was incalculable, creating ruptures in historical memory and cultural continuity that would never be fully repaired. For the monks, nuns, and friars themselves, the dissolution represented a profound personal crisis. Approximately 9,000 religious found themselves suddenly cast out of the lives they had chosen, compelled to exchange their habits for secular dress and their monastic obedience for an uncertain future. Those who cooperated with the suppression received pensions, though these varied considerably based on the wealth of their house and their own status within it. Some older religious struggled to adapt to life outside the cloister, while younger members often married and entered professions. Former monks became schoolmasters, tradesmen, or even Anglican priests, their past lives gradually receding into memory. The theological justification for this wholesale transformation evolved alongside the political and economic imperatives. Cromwell's propaganda presented the monasteries as corrupt and superstitious institutions, their wealth diverted from truly charitable purposes to support idle and immoral religious. This narrative found ready acceptance among those already inclined toward reform, creating a constituency that supported, if not the method, then at least the outcome of the dissolution. The resources seized from the church were portrayed as being returned to their proper use, supporting the crown, strengthening the nation, and funding education and charity through new foundations. Indeed, Henry did establish new bishoprics with monastic wealth, creating 6 new sees, including Westminster, Oxford, and Gloucester, and endowed several colleges at Oxford and Cambridge. Christ Church, Oxford, rose literally from the ashes of St. Fredeswide's Priory, its magnificent Tom Tower built with stones from the demolished monastic church. These foundations represented the king's attempt to channel religious resources into institutions that would serve his vision of a reformed but still Catholic English church, free from papal interference but preserving traditional theology and practice in most respects. The process of dissolution revealed the administrative sophistication of the Tudor state. Cromwell's machinery of government proved capable of carrying out an operation of breathtaking scale and complexity, inventorying, valuing, and redistributing. The clang of steel echoed through the mist-shrouded valleys, a grim symphony heralding the dawn of a new era. As the last vestiges of Roman order crumbled like weathered parchment, the lands once governed by imperial law fell into shadow, their carefully maintained roads now overgrown with the thorny embrace of nature's reclamation. What emerged from this twilight was not a single unified darkness, but 1,000 points of flickering light, castles, monasteries, and fortified towns, each struggling to maintain its own fragile sphere of order in a world turned upside down.